thanks, Steffi. Many thanks, James, for your hospitality, for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be here. So my topic, as you see, is visual culture in the Berlin Republic. The lecture addresses key developments in the visual culture of Germany since the establishment of the unified Germany as what came to be called the Berlin Republic. The shifting of the governmental structures of Germany back to its old capital, with the new Federal Republic taking the place of both the West German Bonn Republic and the GDR, was a contentious matter. Most famously, Jürgen Habermas, the doyen of German social and political thinking, entered the debate to question the foundations of this new republic in Die Normalität einer Berliner Republik. The English translation, which you see there, loses the ironically inflected normality that is attributed to the Berlin Republic here. For Germany as a country that for Habermas provides a compelling case against established normative ideas of nationhood after the state-sponsored crimes of the 20th century. For him, the reconstitution of Germany on the basis of an old nation-state model is both inadequate and dangerous. We might think of it emblematically in the visual cultural form of Thomas Schütter's sculpture, Father State, an overbearing patriarchal figure, but with his hands bound in his coat, seen here on display outside the new National Gallery in Berlin. And as perhaps a transnational counter-image, German-Turkish performance artist Nezaket Ekici from her video work National Anthems, in which she performs the words of the German anthem to the music of the Turkish and vice versa. Habermas calls for a post-national norm of civil society based upon what he calls constitutional patriotism, with an open political public sphere enlivened and ensured by communicative action. This then is the challenge that he lays down for the polity of the Berlin Republic and its claims to normalcy. And I see visual culture as playing a particular role in engaging with that challenge. The term visual culture is in need of a bit of definition here. The humanities have seen a sequence of turns in recent years, not least the visual turn, towards a concern with how visuality works in culture at large. In particular, this turn has been concerned with the event character of visual culture, with how it takes effect or is enacted over time and in space. A crucial matter is how looking is brought into play by visual cultural objects, exposing the character of the visual event as, to cite cultural theorist Mika Baal, performing acts of seeing. Visual culture in this lecture will encompass architecture, museum displays, public spectacle and film, as well as painting, sculpture, photography, mixed media works, and performance work, all of them seen from this perspective of the visual event. Plato, in his allegory of the cave with its projected shadows, inaugurated an attitude of distrust towards the image, wanting to exclude its seductively imitative effects from his republic. How then might the role of images be understood as an inclusive part of the Berlin Republic? And how do they enable acts of seeing to be performed in the mode of communicative action? Are the varied effects of image making in visual culture to be cast on the side of the illusory shadows for enchained viewing subjects in Plato's cave? Or can some at least be seen in a more positive, critical light? Of course, German visual culture in the 20th century has a particular historical charge, having produced a dark set of dominant shadow images during the National Socialist period and its aftermath. This has provoked the need among visual artists to work against the back projections of that historical catalogue. We could think, for instance, of Anselm Kiefer's Besetzungen, or Occupations project of 1969, where the artist photographed himself giving the Nazi salute in various European locations. Here, in a co-option of monumental sculptural gesture, perhaps the sort of gesture that Schutter's father state could find himself enacting in a kind of historically conditioned reflex if his hands were unbound. And here, an occupation of the iconography of the German Romantic Sublime in the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich. This is work that indeed turns the visual object of the artwork into visual event, with its exorbitantly performative character. It reenacts a historical performance of ideology in order to bear witness to its persistent hold on the visual cultural imagination. I'll consider here what has become of that hold in the last 25 years and how to place the visual culture of the Berlin Republic between the complacent claims of normalcy that Habermas warns against and the work of critical revision or resistance. My concern is to show how German visual culture of the last 2 decades projects forms of historical double vision, with one eye on the breaks and divisions of the past and one looking for present and future perspectives. Berlin, as the renovated capital of the new Germany and the privileged stage for its enactments of political and cultural identity, will be the central focus here, which is not, of course, to suggest that German visual culture only happens in Berlin, rather that the capital provides a particularly charged arena for it. I'll give attention both to the more official forms of image making on the part of the nation and its capital, and to more countercultural trends. And at the same time, the lecture will recognize that German visual culture may take place outside the borders of the nation, or indeed within them, but as undertaken by non-nationals, especially in Berlin, which is perhaps the leading contemporary international center in this field. The mass events of the autumn of 1989 in Berlin provided one of the most potent spectacles in recent global history. In many respects, what German calls the Wende, the historical turn that prepared the ground for the Berlin Republic, went hand in hand with a kind of visual turn in Germany. It had its primary impact in visual mediation, with the scenes of the fall of the wall broadcast around the world as perhaps the ultimate television event of the late 20th century, one that we've had a chance, of course, to review in the anniversary events of the last couple of months. It was spectacle of a political historical kind, but also a visual cultural happening performed for global audiences. And for the purposes of this televisual spectacle, the wall and the historical architectural features that surrounded its focal site, the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate, presented a powerfully telegenic scenography for the representation of breaking down barriers between the two cultures of the divided Germany and of the Cold War blocs at large. The wall was already an object of visual culture when it functioned as a barrier between East and West Berlin, in particular a canvas for graphic art on its western side. With impromptu works from amateurs and staged interventions from international star artists such as Keith Haring, the wall became the most extensive piece of collaborative visual culture on the globe. Its painted remains, dubbed the East Side Gallery, are currently the object of standoff between protesters, including artists, and municipally supported property developers. The wall as gallery now has a memorial function, but perhaps devoted less to the violence of division than to the place of urban anti-art as a form of popular occupation of visual cultural space in a city that's increasingly driven by the global forces of capital development. At the time of its fall, the wall also served as an object of and framework for visual cultural spectacle. A particular example would be Jürgen Böttcher's film The Wall of 1990. As an artist working in the GDR, Böttcher experienced the wall as a provocation, a commanding visual object that was, however, taboo for visual cultural representation on its eastern side. After it was breached, he set about making his film on and around it, projecting historical footage of the wall onto its facade and recording the activities of others responding to and working upon it. Böttcher's film can be understood as a kind of revision of the shadow projections of Plato's cave, encouraging a contemplation of images on the wall, but one that emancipates the viewer as a critical subject of history. The fall of the wall becomes visual event in Mika Bar's sense, with hands-on activities of performance artists, such as the one you see here undertaking a kind of choreographic parkour of the wall. At its best, as in this work before you by the artist Blue, the same can be said of the mural art that has sprung up on firewalls across Berlin in recent years. It works in the graffiti tradition of the wall artists, asking questions about the masking and unmasking of urban space, and by giving face to that space, encouraging a popular engagement with the environment. While the wall acted as extended screen or canvas for visual cultural work of various kinds, the architecture of Berlin more broadly has also been the object of such work in its processing as center of the new republic. The treatment of two monumental buildings, governmental palaces of different kinds, will serve as examples here. As the wall fell, so the Reichstag was made available for refitting at one end of Unter den Linden. And the GDR Palace of the Republic, so-called, was set for decommissioning at the other. The heavy stone Reichstag, ravaged by war and neglect, was in waiting to become the parliament of the new republic, while the mirror glass box of the Palace of the Republic, which had taken the place of the demolished imperial city palace, stood as an imposing monument to the self-projection of the GDR. As sites of memory, saturated with ideology and historical happening, these palatial seats of government were prime objects for the treatment of visual culture on a mass popular scale. While the Reichstag was dedicated to the German people, the Volk, its appropriation, perhaps the most spectacular visual cultural event of the late 20th century, was also an act of internationalization. Christo had not been able to realize his 1970s project for a wrapped fence to run the length of the wall. But in 1995, he and his collaborator Jean-Claude achieved a parallel project, the wrapping of the Reichstag. Following approval by a vote of the Bonn Parliament in 1991, the Reichstag was duly wrapped in vertical sheets of canvas and became an enormously successful popular spectacle. If this had taken place before the fall of the wall, it could only have been understood as a representation of democracy under wraps or as phantom, and a provocation to the German democratic republic. It now became, however, an image of a more ritual kind, a shrouding that was making ready for the revelatory unwrapping of the new democratic settlement of the Berlin Republic. In common with much of the public art that would follow, it was transitory work with the character of an event. It was received as a kind of visual cultural festival for the new German polity and for international visitors to it. As a monumental tent with free access to gather around its spectacular exterior, it created the conditions for huge crowds to participate in its event character and in collective, also photographic, ownership of that event. Now, while the Reichstag was being reconstructed with the signature transparency of a new dome by Norman Foster applied to it, the other palace took center stage in artistic and public discussion around the interaction of visual culture and politics. Debates raged over the retention or replacement of the Palace of the Republic, with conservative opinion broadly vindicating its demolition and the restitution of its Baroque predecessor, while left-leaning commentators and activists favored the preservation of this GDR site of memory at the heart of the capital. Pending the resolution of the debate, the Palace of the Republic became the arena for a series of works within, around, and about this site of relatively recent memory. Photographer Thomas Florschütz and writer Durs Grünbein collaborated on a book of images of the palace in the process of its dismantling, interspersed with Berlin poems, which, if not nostalgic for the building and the ideology that occupied it, nonetheless creates a melancholic effect. Grünbein ironically notes that the building, with what he calls the Platonic name, Palace of the Republic, will be long outlived by the remains of ancient buildings on display in the nearby state museums. In a more light-footed mode, Stephanie Böckle, with her interesting questions of dismantling, reconstruction, and mock-up in the new Berlin, made wallpaper carrying the pattern of the building's exterior, which was then hung as ironic art of memory in the offices of leading cultural and political figures. You can't make them out, but Daniel Barenboim is there, for instance, in the center. Both the exterior and the stripped interior of the palace were also given over to event-based visual cultural interventions in the period of the so-called interim usage between 2003 and 2005, with the palace dubbed the Volkspalast, or People's Palace, for the purpose. Drawing on Cedric Price's classic 1961 concept for a fun palace, the building was repurposed for visual culture in the mode of communicative happening. The fun here was in the nature of critical questioning. In January 2005, Norwegian artist Lars Ramberg mounted the word Zweifel, doubt, in enormous lightbox letters on top of the palace, and thereby highlighted the programmatic challenge of the interim usage of the palace, casting doubt on the political settlement of the new republic and its visual cultural self-presentation. His intervention marked the erstwhile Palace of the Republic out as an allegorical palace of doubt. In the following year, the demolition of the palace became a time-based spectacle in itself, with the installation of an observation platform and a documentary webcam recording the process from the roof of the nearby German Historical Museum. What will be made of the emerging spectacle of the reconstructed Baroque city palace, a kind of monumental simulacrum of a lost site of memory, remains to be seen. Anyone recalling Ramberg's doubt writ large on the top of the old palace might well view the reconstruction as the crowning example of the new Berlin's facadism, what Grünbein calls a Potemkin castle. Now, while the refashioning of buildings carries particular weight in the visual cultural field, so does the reworking of the body. If 20th century German visual culture has shadow images in its back catalogue, then these are not least, of course, images of the body, in particular the body staged or exhibited as heroic or as abject. Kiefer's enactments in his Occupations series can be understood as its attempts to expose and to exercise those images and their occupation of representational space on both national and international levels. How then has the body been treated in the visual culture of the Berlin Republic? And what relationship does this have to the enablement of an open and communicative body politic? The interventions range from strategic representations of physical absence to provocative enactments of presence. The absenteeism of the body that's a significant strand in the visual culture of this period is a corollary of the shadow images of National Socialist Germany. It applies in particular to memorial culture and to what James Young has called the counter-monumental, a tendency that's come to dominate public memorial practice in Germany since unification. Examples of this practice, which involves presentations of disappearance, are legion, both in Berlin and across the Republic. Perhaps the best known are those by sculptor Jochen Gerz, as in his 2,146 stones memorial against racism. Here, the names of Jewish cemeteries that existed in Germany before the Holocaust were inscribed on the underside of stones laid in the space in front of the regional parliament in Saarbrücken. This led to the space being renamed the Square of the Invisible Monument, marking the work of public visual culture in absentia. As with Geertz's other interventions in public space, bodies, here the bodies of the dead that are represented metonymically or by proxy in the hidden names of the cemeteries, are what is most invisible in this work. Needless to say, it's an artistic practice that can come riskily close to the failure or avoidance of memory work that it wants to challenge. Similar types of representational logic apply to some of the principal memorials of the capital, works of abandonment or evacuation of embodied existence. Here too, the logic is metonymic. Biedermann's The Abandoned Room / Space, Raum, incorporates both meanings, which is located in an old Jewish area of the city, depicts domestic furniture abandoned by those who used it. Ullmann's Library on the Bebelplatz, scene of the book burning in 1933, represents a removal of books from the empty underground shelves visible through a pane of glass in the square. The human absence that is signified at one remove by the missing books is indicated in the inscription on the plaque for the memorial of lines by Heinrich Heine. This was but a prelude. In the place where books are burned, people too will be burned in the end. And Eisenmann's Memorial for the Murdered Jews of Europe appears as a set of stylized sarcophagi, but in blocks that exclude the possibility of incorporating the bodies of those who are commemorated. What these counter-monuments, whether invisible, Geertz, barely visible, Ullmann, or insistently but blankly visible, Eisenmann, have in common is reduction towards a degree zero of visual culture. Like the voids of Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum, the memory work they do is of a strategically negative or absent kind, requiring work, embodied work of communicative action on the part of the polity that hosts them. It's work that doesn't always work, it should be said. Now, a final example of this visual elision of the German historical body in its most extreme form takes us back to the Reichstag, a seat of the Berlin Republic. In the atrium of the Reichstag foyer hangs Gerhard Richter's Black, Red, Gold, made up of 3 slim rectangular blocks of color hung in a vertical strip. The colors approximate to, but are not tonally identical with those of the flag of the Federal Republic, to be seen flying over the building. Each of the blocks is made of 2 panels painted behind glass, thus introducing seams into the dismantled projection of the flag, perhaps representing the melding of 2 black, red, and gold flags. The flag of the GDR, of course, was also in those colors. But one of the studies for the work reveals a counter-image, a radical one. Richter's original concept was for a vertical strip, as if frames from a black and white film, of 4 painted images of concentration camp scenes, drawn from photographic sources. These shadow images, deemed inappropriate for the emblematic foyer work, are radically sublimated in black, red, gold. It's only in the light of the knowledge that an informed viewer might bring to the work, whether of its genesis or of Richter's broader portfolio, that they might be unfolded by the visual event of the abstracted flag. If Richter's work has gravitated between radical abstraction or sublimation and images of bodily extremity, this split might be seen as characteristic for contemporary German visual culture. The body, as displayed post-mortem, takes a different form in one of the most spectacular phenomena of German visual culture in the last 20 years, the body worlds of Gunther von Hagens. The provocation of von Hagen's exhibitions of plastinated human and other anatomies, their skin stripped in obscene or grotesquely playful exposure, inevitably harbors particularly German implications. Von Hagens, appears as styled between a taboo-breaking medical scientist and an idiosyncratic artist, after the model of Joseph Beuys with the trademark hat. But while Beuys's assemblages and vitrine pieces represented the corporeal extremity of the Second World War and of the Holocaust in carefully estranged forms, von Hagen's anatomical shows seemed to claim an impossible normality for his drastic form of bodyworks. Body Worlds is presented as a contribution to the project of the Enlightenment, a project to which Germany, of course, gave so much in its heyday. But it also taps into an obscene possibility that the Germanness of the show and its impresario add a prurient appeal to the event. Gerhard Richter is in important respects a photographic artist. In his work, photography reveals its particular political and also ethical dimension as a medium particularly associated with historical evidence. If the works of a post-war generation of painters, Richter himself, Kiefer, Baselitz, and others, have placed Germany at the forefront of international developments in the medium of painting, the same can be said of the photographic works of German artists and of artists working in Germany since unification. Here too, a crux of the work is the relationship between the bodily, following the model of portrait photography, and spatial frames, following the models of landscape or interior photography. The question is, what can still be done with these media in an age that is said to be both post-painterly and post-photographic? For photography in particular, the reality index of the analog process has been superseded by the advanced editorial treatments of the digital, which might seem to take the medium away from its established political and ethical function as witness to the actual conditions of identity and society. However, the post-photographic condition of contemporary visual culture should not be taken for granted. Even as it marks its own artifice, its evidential unreliability with the technical shift from the camera lens to the computer screen, photography has burgeoned as a compelling element of German visual culture in the last 2 decades. We might start by considering a leading American photographer, Nan Goldin, who helped define Berlin's artistic underground after unification. Her works are caught between a provocatively intimate sense of bodily presence in individual or group portrait work, and its absence in her photographs of demonstratively empty domestic spaces. While the portraits work to celebrate the pleasures of the body in more or less explicit ways, the empty interiors appear to mark the transience of the corporeal presence and of the pleasure that has inhabited them. The community she portrayed was also ravaged by AIDS. The treatment, both of bodies and of scenes without bodies, develops a form of visuality that is also haptic in effect. That is, it touches the viewer, it breaches conventions of shame in visual culture. We might look at this through one of Goldin's less drastic portraits, Siobhan with a Cigarette, Berlin 1994, an image where the time and the place of the title is no arbitrary marker, but makes a claim for lived experience in that place at that time. In this portrait of her lover, Goldin adopts a restrained, demure technique that nonetheless exposes the subject, puts her forward in photographic space in a more subtle sense. Thus, the hand with the cigarette is held forward, its line echoed by that of the fragment of furniture, which you can't see in the left-hand corner of this image. Unfortunately, there is such a fragment which echoes the hand, with the ash and the slight wisp of smoke, again barely visible there, proffered as an index of the time-based medium. The image evokes the Weimar style of Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity, as a high point in the modern German visual cultural tradition. This photographic treatment of the body incorporates historical styling, therefore, while also looking to the digital in its hyper-real challenge to the logic of two-dimensional representation. Now, Goldin's portraits and interiors are aligned with two key categories in photography by Germans and or made in Germany since the early 1990s. And the third would be exteriors, or the portraiture of architectures and landscapes. We can see these in the works of a group of internationally recognized contemporary German photographers, as they work within and between the generic categories of portrait, interior, and exterior. What they have in common is the exploration of Ball's visual event, with a highly developed sense of acts of viewing, both of the image and within it. Examples of the intimate portrait include work by the London-based Wolfgang Tillmans, who develops a queer aesthetic related to Goldin's, or the feminist work of Rosemarie Trockel. Tillmans' body images are closely linked to and often combine with his work on materials and interiors, with an attention to different forms of skin, actual and metaphorical. Trockel, too, shows her concern for skin as a medium for photographic work in Prime Age of 2012, in what is apparently an allegory of a prime age that may be personal or may be cultural. The exquisitely decorative artwork of the tattoos partially cover the no less exquisite androgynous body and also represent it as an object of exhibition, as a medium for showing, a corollary of canvas or of photographic paper. In the work of both Tillmans and Trockel, the individual body images always relate to other works with which they cohabit the space of the exhibition interior as a kind of visual event in montage. The interior, including the gallery interior, as visual cultural object, has a particular function in the photographic work of Candida Höfer, Thomas Struth, and Thomas Demand. Höfer's work has generally focused on institutional interiors, from the enfolded ornament of Baroque churches and opera houses to more minimal modernist spaces. Her particular interest lies in spaces of knowledge, such as libraries, here the State Library in Berlin, museums, and lecture theatres. And she finds that it is when evacuated of human presence that they reveal most about, I quote, what people do in these spaces and what these spaces do to them. Thus, her Dresden series includes interiors from institutions that are devoted to the study of human life, but apparently devoid of its traces. The shots of the German Hygiene Museum of 2000, no ideologically neutral space this, of course, present an absence of human subjects or material in a study of cleanliness of space and line. Struth, on the other hand, characteristically treats his interiors as forms of group portrait. He's perhaps best known for works that show viewers around exhibits in galleries or museums, thus creating an effect of a picture within a picture, viewing of acts of viewing. An example would be his medium-scale shots of rooms in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, where viewers are cast in staged clusters around the often broken bodily and architectural forms of archaeological exhibition. Like Höfer, he takes an interest in organized spaces of viewing, but there's also a contingently distributed character to the human acts of looking that he captures. Thomas Demand, in the scenes that he mocks up for his works, adopts a more radical approach to the exposure of the interior as viewing space. He creates spaces that typically appear to be after the event reconstructions of scenes of crime or other disruptive acts, often anonymous in character and devoid of human presence. Thus, his 1994 scenographic work, Raum, again, room or space, shows an apparently generic office that has been wrecked through some drastic intervention. The viewer might or might not know that the image is taken from a reconstruction of a photograph of the scene in Hitler's HQ in East Prussia after the assassination attempt in July 1944. So this marks the 50th anniversary of that photographic event. His work, Demant's works appear to present the uncanny counter-image of the organized institutional spaces of Höfe and Struth. He achieves similar levels of pictorial precision, but exposes disorder at personal and political levels in the conditions of the interior. And when his interiors appear to be in absolute order, such as his mock-up of the evacuated space of the pre-unification Bonn Parliament, the uncanny sense of a crime scene or of a post-human condition persists. Now, while Demant's Raum is translatable and also readable at once as a representation of a room and a more abstract study of space in an enclosed form, Andreas Gursky has established himself as a preeminent photographer of the spatial, and in particular of German spaces, on an epically expansive scale. The missing bodies of Demant's crime scenes or Höfe's institutional interiors also characterize Gursky's best-known landscape images. In works such as Rhine 2, with its lateral lines working as a set of horizons, but without depth, there's a lack of human figures to provide scale for this most German of rivers. Natural or cultivated expanse thus appears as abstracted without measure. And where the human does feature, is frequently in forms of spectacular massing, also experienced as a kind of disembodiment. Accordingly, when Gursky presents an internal view of the federal parliament, the representatives of the German people appear as a constellation of indistinct figures, segmented laterally by window frames, as if repeating the division of the Rhine landscape. It remains uncertain whether the visual tricks played by the image are the product of the building's architecture or of the sort of digital manipulation that Gursky standardly applies in his post-photographic work. As if in dialogue with Demant's dark, inscrutable parliament, the image accordingly asks questions about what the transparency of view enabled by Foster's glass walls in the Reichstag, what that transparency might reveal of political representation and responsibility in the nerve center of the Berlin Republic. So my conclusion, so what? I hope not so what, but so what? New normality. We should perhaps conclude by returning to the cautionary note in Habermas's interrogation of what it might mean to see the Germany of the Berlin Republic as normal. The spaces and forms of visual culture in contemporary Germany cannot easily achieve normality in their relation to questions of national identity and history, that's clear. At the same time, the examples given here should have shown that German visual culture is not circumscribed by the contours of its national shadow images. The visual cultural shape of things is more complicated than that. It's not reducible to the aftermath of those historical acts, nor indeed to the borders of the contemporary nation. Thus, Alexander Lahner's Better Living, Schöner Wohnen, for Munich's version of London's Fourth Plinth, was an interactive domestic space created within and on the plinth itself and inhabited by a series of lodgers in an unconventional form of quotidian normality. This was the occupation of an imperial site of memory by a work named for a lifestyle magazine. What is clear is that any notion of normality needs to be qualified carefully here, understood as a field of contesting normative and counter-normative positions. I think the final word on this might go to Gerhard Richter. As perhaps the master artist of the Berlin Republic, an archivist and reworker of its shadow images, he talks about his sense of the inadequacy of the visual cultural means at his disposal for his project of representation. This practitioner of exceptional technical and aesthetic precision describes the impossible congruence of the object and the means of representation as a perfectly normal state of affairs the normal mess, if you like. Thank you.